Hello, it's Mark from LightMap. I'm going to show you how to use the new motion blur in HDR Light Studio Xenon Drop 3. So we've got this scene loaded into 3ds Max and we are interactive rendering here with Corona, and I've got the HDRI map loaded that I want, and at this moment this car is static within this tunnel. So the wheels are actually animated, so if I go to frame 5 of the animation, we'll then see the wheels start spinning and they will have motion blur coming from 3ds Max. And then what we want to do is blur the HDRI map to match with this motion blur. So to do this, we right click on the HDRI map and we merge it to a composite, because the filters can only be applied to composites. So with this composite selected, we come to the filter and we select motion blur. Now straight away you can see that this HDR here has been motion blurred, and by quite a lot. And if we come over to the settings here, let's just have a look at what they do. So the filter is called motion blur, the type is called spherical, which makes sense for doing on a HDRI map like this. And then we've got a U direction and a V direction. That basically specifies the direction in which you are heading. So if I set this to say 0.25, that will be a quarter of the way along the map. So it's basically a UV space starting from the corner here. So 0, 0 is here and 1, 1 is here. And you can use these sliders to change the position. Now, that's not very intuitive using these sliders. So we have a better way. We've extended the light paint system. So in any view now, you can, because we have the motion blur selected with spherical mode, we could come to this new drop down and it chooses what the interactions with the canvas or the render view are going to do. So for example, on the render view, use the drop down, pick motion blur. Now let's change this to illumination. So then the direction will be normal to where we click on the model. And if we click on the number plate here, we'll do a light paint through to 3ds Max and back. And then that will set the direction to be these numbers here. And that has basically set the direction that we're heading in, which is basically normal to this number plate. Now, in actual fact, for this particular setup, it would be far easier to just come down to the canvas itself, and let's even zoom into this area at the back here and choose the light paint tool and choose motion blur, and then let's click in the area where we want to place it. Now, because it's blurred, you might be struggling with seeing this properly, so let's take the blur length, take that down to 0, so we see a perfectly clear view of the map. And then we can see that this road is disappearing off to this point here. So if I click on there, that will then instantly update the motion blur direction. And then if we then start to increase the blur length on the slider here, we can then actually start to see that motion blur come into effect. Now we could put this up to incredibly high values and it will be like you're going light speed, which is a bit unrealistic. So let's put this down to a lower value. Okay, now there are 3 accuracy settings, let's call them quality settings really, which is low, medium and high, and that controls how many samples are used. You get a great result with medium, so I'm going to leave it with that. And then we have this bias setting. Now, the bias controls how far around the motion blur is acting. Now, it's easier to show if I just make the blur length really high, so that we're, well, not that high, let's say that high, and everything is super blurred until we get to the direction you're heading and where you've come from. Now if we change this bias setting, you can see that more of the map in the direction you're traveling and coming from is being not blurred, so only the side of you is being blurred, and as you come all the way through to the maximum of 10, you'll find just the sides of the motion blur, the side of the map is being blurred, and then the direction you're heading in is largely unblurred. Now this is very much just an artistic control, so what we can do is if we just take that back to the default of 1, and let's get a blur length, a motion blur length of something that looks kind of reasonable. So if we for some reason wanted where we can see the HDRI map in the background here to not have that blurred, we could just start to tweak the bias setting. There you go. So now you can see this part is not being blurred and then this part is being blurred. So that's what that control is about. So just to recap on the motion blur settings here, there's the type where we use spherical when we are blurring the HDRI map. There's a U direction and V direction that we can control with these sliders, but you can also come to the canvas or to the render view and use the new drop down to change from the default of moving a light to actually setting this motion blur direction. So that's what the motion blur setting is for. There's the length, which is the strength or the speed of that motion blur, and then there's the bias, which allows you to remove blur in the direction and you're going to and coming from for artistic purposes, and then the accuracy setting. So what I'll do now is I'll actually render this HDRI map with this motion blur at a higher resolution, where you'll actually then see far better the effect of the motion blur on this shot. Okay, so there you see the final results with the higher resolution HDRI map that we rendered. Okay, so let's take this a stage further. The motion blur is being applied to the composite. Now within the composite, we've just got the original HDRI map. The great thing about it is we can add additional lights if we want to this, and they will get motion blurred as well, and we can edit them and do all the normal things we can do in HDR Light Studio. So if I come and let's say get this fluorescent tube light and I say put this over here and turn the brightness right up. So now we've created an extra light that's reflecting in there. We could say change the colour and say make it a little bit orangey. Okay, and then let's get a round light, let's say this one, and we'll put that, we'll drag that, let's use rim placement mode here, and we'll drag that and we'll put that on here, so it should add it to the map there. And then let's change the size of this to be just, I don't know, 2 by 2, so it's quite small. And then if we change the brightness of that to be quite bright, and then if we change the position to be over here, and even further over here. Okay, you can see how easy it was to add that in. And if we come back up a level, so we're looking inside to the composite at the minute, but if we looked at the blur result on the canvas, you can see everything within that composite has had the motion blur applied to it. So to finish my lighting design, I'm actually going to put a spherical filter, which is just a spherical light with some colour on it, onto here. Double click that, and then I'm going to position that so that this side of the map is warm and the rear is cold, and the blend mode is colour. We'll just boost that up a little bit so that creates a nice colour atmosphere, and then we will re-render that. And there we go. So you can see how easy it is to add motion blur to an existing map, or to edit that map and add extra lights and color it, but with that motion blur filter on hand when you need it. So we hope you enjoy using the new motion blur filter in HDR Light Studio.